Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi guys, welcome to another edition of the SportsPro Podcast. This slightly unfamiliar voice is Tom Bassam, digital editor at SportsPro. I'm taking over the reins this week from Owen Connolly while he's on a little bit of annual leave. This week we've got a slightly different edition of the podcast. We're going to be discussing in depth one of the features that was a big part of the most recent issue of SportsPro Magazine. And I'm joined by its author, Sam Carp. Hi Sam.
Hi Tom, how are you doing? How does it feel to be sat in the hosting seat this week?
I'll be honest, it's a little bit strange, but I'm sure I'll get used to it, and hopefully you guys will too. So just a little bit of detail about the show. We're going to be discussing Sam's latest big long read about the in-venue experience post-coronavirus. And then in part two of the show, we're going to be hearing from Botan Osman, Chief Executive of Restrata, who are a company involved in creating the biosecure environment for the West Indies-England Test Series. But I'll let Sam explain a little bit more about that later on. So, turning our attentions to the kind of main focus of what we're going to talk about today, Sam has written a feature which has got a lovely vague title called One Step at a Time. Sam, do you mind telling me a little bit more about what it's all about?
Yeah, I mean, maybe vague, but hopefully those who read the piece will understand why it was called that eventually. And kudos to anyone who does get to the end, because it was quite a meaty read. But yeah, in a nutshell, it's about the venue experience and how that is going to change post COVID, both initially with kind of these reduced capacities that we're already seeing, and then when stadiums are allowed to start selling out again. Admittedly, it's hardly the first piece out there like this. I think quite a few people have probably written trying to hypothesize what the return to stadia is going to look like. But I think we can all probably remember the last sporting event we went to, and I think we're going to have to accept that the next time we do go to one, it's going to look very, very different. I actually remember going to a Crystal Palace game about a week before the UK started going into lockdown, and even then people were being pretty tentative. I think I even tweeted at the time that I'd never seen such a long queue for people to wash their hands at a football match. But even those things that are like an accepted part of the match day experience, so queuing for toilets, for concessions, the halftime rush at a game, things that you don't really think about when you're there, those things aren't really going to be allowed to happen when we do start going back. So we've seen it happening recently here in the UK with some fans being allowed back into trial events, although as we know, some of those have now been put on hold. But actually, one of the first glimpses that we got of it all starting to happen was a boxing event in Nicaragua, which took place at the end of April, which I'm sure we all remember as a time when we were pretty deep in lockdown. So that was probably one of the only sporting events going on at that time, and almost certainly the only one going ahead with fans. And even then, there were spectators turning up in their face masks, having their temperatures checked at the door, and sitting 2 seats apart once they were inside. Things that are all pretty alien to us, or certainly were at the time, but are probably going to become normal, at least for now, when spectators are allowed back sort of universally. So yeah, I mean, this feature essentially broke down some of those elements. I think I ended up breaking it down into 6 parts. I guess almost those one steps at a time, you could say, that we're going to be taking as we do return to sports venues. So I'd probably break those 6 parts down into access, testing, hygiene, touchless experiences, crowd monitoring, and digitalization, all of which are things that are going to inform the venue experience. So when fans do start returning. So anyway, before I ramble on for too long, one of the first people that I did speak to about this was Christopher Lee. He's the managing director for EMEA at Stadium Architect Populous, and as we're about to hear, he set the scene quite nicely in terms of what some of the key considerations are going to be for venue operators when stadiums do start opening again.
We've got a huge team working on this around the world with our clients through North America, Europe, and Asia, looking at what return to venue really looks like. So we've sort of put together a task force which has brought a bunch of external experts and epidemiologists and cleaners and sanitization and doctors and you name it, roboticists, looking at what it looks like. And I think there's a whole series of different routes which it may take. I mean, I think the simplest solution, as you said, I mean, really in the UK and Europe, the rest of the season will be played behind closed doors, and obviously all the leagues have done an enormous amount of planning how that works. I think once you start looking at returning fans to venues, it very much depends on where you are and what the local guidance is. But if you took the sort of really simple, basic WHO rules or our current UK government of distancing of varying between 1 metre and 2, you're clearly looking at considerably lower numbers of people in the stadium. And it's probably more like, at a 2 metre social distance, you're looking at something really in the sort of 10% of capacity in stadiums to observe that rule. And I think there's an enormous amount of work looking at everything from how you clearly get to the venue. So obviously, if you looked at a big city like London, how the public transport works, what kind of times do you need to even get to a venue? Clearly, outside venues, a lot of the work that I think had been overlaid, particularly around security and terrorism threats, the mag and bag, which is increasing in venues, will only be increased with security screening of some form. Most of our clients and the work we're doing with them is looking at some kind of health screening, whether that's a temperature checks or the likes. Some are talking about health passports if they exist or work, so that the ability to get into the venue will take a considerably longer period of time. And different owners that we're working on different venues are looking at different approaches to how you do that. Do you end up with a time that you are allocated to arrive to the venue, and you try and phase people in that way? So you're controlling people that, for a 2 o'clock kickoff, you're at the 11 o'clock slot or the 12 o'clock slot or the 1 o'clock slot, so we can manage those crowds externally. And then once you go inside, there are sort of two broad theories on how this works, and I think this will probably be depending on as you sort of stage this, and I think it'll evolve over time. But the very crude, everyone stays 2 meters apart, like I said, has a really big impact. Clearly in the seating bowl, that you're predominantly, if you just thought every other seat in a row is knocked out roughly, and then every other row is knocked out, that's the kind of capacities you're beginning to think about. Obviously, then getting people to those seats and from those seats, most of what we call the vomitories, which are the gateways into the seating bowl, you end up having to set up one-way system, so you're coming in one way and leaving another way. And then on a concourse, for example, there's a lot of work on how you get food. Are you pre-ordering? Is it an app-based piece where you order and then go and collect from a box or a hole or however you collect? And then social distancing clearly in the concourse itself, and there's lots of different technology mostly that we're looking at. I mean, there's very crude, which a lot of us are looking at, squares on the concourse that are 2 meters apart. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of signage, and all the existing signage needs to be overhauled. But then you start bringing in technology overlays, whether it's simple devices you're wearing, which beep when you're within a set distance from someone else. There are more sophisticated versions which do similar bits, but then also add a track and trace overlay on top of that. So, it tells you if you're in 2 meters, or eventually to be able to tell you if you've been in contact with someone who has been diagnosed with the virus, overlaid on top of obviously with the government apps that they're doing. A lot of work on robots and robotic piece, which I think is really interesting, that you can start. There's an enormous amount of work we're doing out there with robots which are linked to CCTV cameras and central command posts, where they can enforce social distancing, they can do guidance. Clearly there's a lot of work on robots who can pour beers and make coffees. So I mean, guess that's a lot of the stuff that our clients are trying to balance at the moment, and just how, frankly, at which point it makes commercial sense to open a stadium with an incredibly low capacity and clearly an increased staffing requirement, and how you keep staff and customers safe.
Wow, that's some really interesting stuff, actually. So, Sam, do you think we're headed for a stadium experience where it's just going to be taped off seats, long queues, lots of people looking around nervously, or is it perhaps going to be something more familiar?
Certainly not familiar. I don't. I don't think would be the way to describe it. I mean, empty seats definitely for now, as we've already seen. One thing that Christopher Lee also talked about before we cut him off there was about how this will also kind of provide an opportunity operating at reduced capacities. It would provide a chance for teams to continue offering some virtual form of the in-venue experience to make some money while they can't sell all their tickets. So similar to some of those things that we've seen already with the with fans being displayed on screens, possibly even going further than that and using VR or AR to somehow have a remote audience appear alongside people who are actually at the venue, which could be quite cool to keep an eye on. But for those that are lucky enough and indeed willing enough to go back to events, their whole sort of journey from leaving the house to attending the game to going back home, it's going to be very different. It's going to be much more controlled, and I think we're gonna see a lot of the things that we're becoming accustomed to in everyday life. So, for example, when we go to the supermarket, for example, when we're getting public transport, I think a lot of the practices that we've seen there are going to become part of the event going experience as well. So that does mean things like staggered entry times, for example, to control how many people are arriving at a venue at once, socially distanced queues, and all of that kind of means that operators are going to have to figure out things like how much space they need around their venues. So, for example, not every stadium has its own site. Some are in the middle of residential neighborhoods, so they're going to have to bear in mind how they can make those things work in practice. And then you're going to have very different things happening when people reach the front of a queue. So I remember speaking to Todd DeBoeuf, who's the president of Top Rank, and this was all the way back in April. But he said at the time that there was going to be some structure similar to what happened after 9/11 to, create a safe environment for returning fans. So that's likely to involve things like temperature checks at the door, the scanning of digital health passports, for example, all of which is going to take up a little bit more time. But there's already kind of some work being done to make that a little bit more seamless, that entry process. So one trial that I mentioned in the piece is that some agencies here in the UK, they've been working with an AI company on developing this sort of thermal screening product that can detect high temperatures in individual fans. So obviously identifying those on the day who might be displaying COVID-19 symptoms. So there's that element of it, but you also have to think about things like security checks, for example. So people aren't going to be happy to be, being frisked, having pat down checks carried out on them after what's been going on, which is where, so for example, facial biometric security systems could come into play, or even robots, which is one of the more extreme examples that I used in the piece. I spoke to a guy called Sylvester De Kaiser, who's the chief executive of a company called RobShare. And so he was saying how his company's robots can check the temperature of 15 people in 1 second. They can also count the number of people in a given space 20 times quicker than a human. So, I mean, that solution isn't something you can probably picture at every venue, but it's certainly one that you could maybe see at those more premium ones. So there's already quite a lot of innovation going on around how these more complicated processes are sped up. But I think in any case, back to your sort of question about whether this is going to be familiar, having basically said already that it's not going to be, I think all of this means that fans are going to have to be provided with a lot more information. So in the build up to and on the day of an event. So in terms of things like when to arrive, which entry points to go in, even advice about whether public transport is going to be busy. So one of the people that I spoke to about this was a chap called Adam Goodyer. He's the chief executive and founder of a company called Realife Tech. They developed something called the COVID Fan Safety Hub. And so, as we're kind of about to hear from him, that platform is essentially designed to be like a fan's companion on the day of a game. It's going to sort of hopefully give them all the information they need about safety and crowd density, and essentially kind of allay some of their anxiety about attending events. But yeah, anyway, I'll leave him to kind of fill in some of those gaps and explain some of the thinking behind that platform.
And it looked at, how do you allay the fears of people planning to go to events? How do you then create a better experience and allay their fears getting there? What is the experience and the safety concerns when they're there, and then how do you deal with them exiting in a safe environment? So we looked at those 4 areas, and then started to focus on some what would be relatively simple ideas. So how do you reduce congestion and contact when you are inside? How do you reduce congestion and contact when you are getting in? So we've developed the ability to link into certain key ticketing systems and be able to pull the ticket information from that, or even have the fans manually input where they are sitting, and then for a set of personalized messaging to appear in the mobile apps. How can you do timed entry based on ticketing? And then not just timed entry, how can you do then timed windows based on that entry time for ordering your concessions, so ordering your beer, so that is done in a controlled way. And that information is presented very, very clearly to the fans, based individually on their accessibility, for example. If you have different accessibility requirements, what are the key safety information that you need to know on getting in and out? How are you going to be able to order things when you're there? What's the nearest toilet that you should be going to? What are the best times? Obviously these things are certain things you can't control, but when will it be less busy? All the way through to a contactless collection of ordering, so mobile ordering of food and beverage, that being able to be controlled by each concession stand, so that they can throttle the amount of time that's coming in, that you can pre-order slots to come and pick up. And then through to crowd density management, looking at where people are congregating, how you can remind them through automated push messages if those densities get too high, as to ensure that you're keeping your distance. So it's a sort of like a companion hub to provide those sort of key elements of functionality.
You're listening to the SportsPro Podcast.
So I saw a poll actually from the Morning Consult, which said that I think it was 79% of respondents said it was important for a vaccine developed before them to feel comfortable in a crowded stadium. But aside from just a vaccination which would provide a large scale herd immunity, what other kind of things are fans asking for from the post-COVID venue experience to make them feel safe?
Yeah, so I think that Morning Consult poll was actually one that I referenced in the piece. And another interesting result within that was that about 3/4 of respondents said that the addition of measures of things like hand sanitizer stations would make them feel much more comfortable attending games or attending sports events. So, I mean, that poll itself was actually carried out back in April. So the results would perhaps be a little bit different now, but they still do give a decent indication of what fan behaviour is going to be like and what people are going to want to be seeing. So it all points to what we know, which is that we're going to have a general public after this that is going to be a lot more health conscious when people do start coming back to events. So, and as you say, given that fans are already returning before a vaccine is in circulation, it's going to be extra important for venue operators to communicate their cleaning practices and show that their venues really are hygienic, because I think that's going to be pretty crucial in giving people the confidence to attend sport again.
I mean, this is something that actually I picked up in your piece. It was about drone cleaning. Is that really something that's in the future? I've always kind of associated drone anything really with like 2030, 2045, a period where Amazon packages turn up and it's delivered by a robot. But is that something that we're actually going to be seeing in the imminent future, you think?
Well, there's certainly some companies that think so, that are looking to make money out of it. I mean, again, this is one of those things that whether it would be deployed at a large scale, I'm not sure. But given the amount of given the way that people move within a bowl area in a stadium, and given how often games take place, especially in indoor arenas like in the NBA and the NHL, there's people coming in and out of those venues sort of almost every 2 days. So it's going to be quite important for those for venue operators to ensure that those surfaces within there are clean and clean very quickly. So there's a company called Eaglehawk, which is based in New York. And yes, Tom, they have actually developed what they describe as a coronavirus killing drone, which basically, it's quite simple the way it works, or by the sounds of it. I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's not very easy to design, but essentially it's designed to hover over an indoor or outdoor sports venue and just spray disinfectant onto facility below. And apparently that's already being marketed to college, major, and minor league teams over in the US. So who knows? Maybe we will see drones being deployed at large before too long. But there are also some businesses doing other cool things, devising solutions that will support regular deep cleaning of the various areas within stadiums when they reopen. When you think about it, it's not just those. It's not just the seating area. It's going to be the bathrooms as well, even all the kitchens. There are just so many different parts of a stadium that are going to have to become more hygienic. So one of the other companies that I referenced in the piece was one called Perform Path, and they're designing these ultraviolet disinfection products, which they claim are effective at killing up to 99.9% of harmful bacteria and viruses. And because of the way it's designed, it's not susceptible to those sort of hands-on cleaning errors such as missing blind spots or incorrect application. So that's kind of another route that venues could look to go down, especially as they look to kind of make these things more efficient. There's an element of kind of having staff doing this, but also at the same time, if you can make it as efficient as possible, some of these technologies are going to be really, really important. But in any case, going back to my interview with Christopher Lee, he made some really good points about how more deep cleaning methods and protocols are going to give fans that confidence to be in venues again, as I said.
Cleaning and sanitation is a really big piece to this, and having, ultimately having enough confidence as a consumer of live events that you're going to be safe going to a venue. So, we're very much seeing, certainly in North America, and I think we'll see here, the introduction of sort of safe and hygiene standards. So a little bit like you go to your local Indian curry house that has a hygiene rating out of 5. I think we'll begin to start seeing that in venues, and I think we'll need to see that as our supporters want to come back, but also want to feel safe. Is the stadium going to, either as a home fan or an away fan potentially, safe enough? And are they doing the right things? And are there operational checks? So there's a lot of work that sanitation companies are looking at. Looking down to what are the surfaces that we've been putting into toilets, concessions, bars. Do we need to start looking at changing out those to be more antiviral, antibacterial surfaces? A lot of the stuff which is very prominent in Asia, these sort of big fogging disinfectant arches, through to I think quite visible cleaning regimes. And I think a lot of that, if you were cynical, is a bit of theatre, but I think our customers will want to see cleaning crews in venue where we try and design and operate our venues that you don't see them. Yeah, so this is all happening behind the scenes, and when you're in the bowl, they're cleaning crews cleaning everything. But I think we'll want to see them more visibly, and so cleaning and hygiene is going to be a much more important part of what we expect as a consumer to in venues to feel safe.
So now we're all kind of getting used to the idea of social distancing, staying a couple of meters apart from everybody. making sure you're all like walking certain directions around, like just going around to the supermarket. There's little arrows on the floor everywhere. What kind of things have venues got to do to manage these behavioural guidelines and track people and make sure they're all going in the right directions and not creating unnecessary risk?
Yeah, I mean, so fans are likely to have their freedom of movement limited a little bit more than they used to when they do find themselves back on the concourses. And yeah, that is kind of to do with minimizing some of that risk. So we will probably see some of those one-way systems, as you mentioned, when it comes to accessing the stadium bowl, where fans enter an entrance one way and then leave through another. And I think it's going to be pretty important when you think of that halftime rush that I mentioned earlier. We're pretty used to when the halftime whistle goes at a football match, everyone clamoring for an exit. That's just not going to be that's just not something that can happen anymore. So I think that's ultimately where crowd monitoring technologies and real-time stadium operation systems are going to start becoming really important. I think we've seen some of those deployed in places even before COVID. I know that last year or maybe the year before, we wrote about the San Francisco 49ers, who I think became the first NFL team to have this kind of real-time stadium operation system, which kind of, allows them to respond to things as they're happening, and then that by consequence enables them to improve the fan experience. But I think now it's going to be really important for venue operators to do that from a practical standpoint as well. So to know how many people are gathering in a specific place at a given time, where bottlenecks are forming, the proximity of fans, all of those things that are going to be important for maintaining that social distancing. And there are various, as I kind of found out while putting this piece together, there are various companies with these solutions out there. One of those I spoke to about this was a Detroit-based startup called WaitTime. Their chief executive, Zach Clymer, was actually on the SportsPro Insider series not too long ago. But so what they've done is they've developed an artificial intelligence system that essentially detects where crowds are gathering, whether it's concession stands, toilets, entry points, and the system then automatically updates signage within the venue to direct people towards other parts of that venue where the queues aren't as big or crowds aren't as dense. So again, this is one of those things that was already being used before COVID. It's being used by the Miami Heat, the 49ers, who I mentioned just then, and also at the Melbourne Cricket Ground in Australia. But they've kind of pivoted since COVID to kind of adapt the technology so that it can respond to some of the needs that venue operators are going to have after this. And that's kind of something that I spoke to Elizabeth Grabowski, who's their design strategy director. She was telling me kind of about how the product has changed since the onset of COVID.
Because of the level and the amount of conversations we've been having, we've actually been able to kind of translate a lot of the best practices from some kind of, like retail environments or environments that are kind of opening up a little sooner than the sports and entertainment venues, and using those best practices and those conversations to kind of shape the sports and entertainment package, which has been really valuable. So I think kind of how the product has shifted is to kind of be very focused on those health and safety elements, and use that guest experience platform as a way to be flexible in real time. So what we're doing is we're kind of taking the software that we already had. We've also added an additional algorithm, which is our entry and exit algorithm. So what that guy does is it kind of tracks how many people are coming into and out of a space, like a restroom or a club or an area that kind of has a limited capacity, keeping track of how many people are in that space, and then using the real-time information to kind of notify whether or not people can be allowed in that space or if they should hold off. We're setting thresholds for each camera so that once certain areas hit certain points, kind of either the security staff or the cleaning staff that's responsible for the area will be notified so that they can respond in real time. That's been pretty consistent across, every vertical and every league. It's been kind of, hey, we're going to add more people, but what our software is doing is making sure that those people know where to go. And then we're also able to kind of use the, historical measurement tools to document whether or not we've met those those guidelines and those mandates that are being set by leagues and governments across the world to say, we shouldn't have this many people, or we should, or how are we going to do it? They're using that information in real time to kind of regulate those so that they're smart and they're flexible and they're responsive to actual crowd conditions. What I think we're uncovering is part of the conversations we're having in response to COVID-19 is like realizing that before it kind of was a necessity. We just didn't look at data in that way. And we're kind of uncovering why it's a necessity right now. Like, for example, we get asked a question very commonly, like, if you turn on your cameras, what's the norm? Like, what do you see? What's something and the norm is distribution. So we often see that people focus on symptoms rather than the cause. Like, for example, they'll say, hey, we really need to speed up and like over engineer the back of house of this location because we always have long lines here. When really that location might be busy because it's near like one of the main entrances in the stair tower and everything. So like it's getting a lot of foot traffic because it's right next to a transportation station outside the door. So because of COVID-19, people are kind of starting to realize that that's a situation that like, oh, we were focusing more on symptoms rather than cause. And the COVID-19 conversation is kind of helping people realize why crowds matter in the first place, where before it was very like transactional based on service rate rather than distribution throughout a building.
So what I'm getting so far is that I'm turning up at a stadium. I'm maybe allowed to sit with one or two people, but generally I'm going to be pretty spaced out. There'll be some robots flying around cleaning everything up. Will I even be able to go and like get food, go to a food concession, visit a toilet? Is that going to be a thing?
Before I answer this, actually, I'm going to ask you, Tom, do you like what you're hearing? Would you still go to an event after this?
I mean, as a skeptic about the live sports experience generally, it would take a lot of convincing. I think some things I think it will work better in more than others. I mean, places where perhaps crowd atmosphere is less important. Tennis, for example, it could be fine. Lawn bowls, maybe, but I mean, it's not going to be quite the same for football, is it? I guess if I was still able to get, I don't know, a decent pie at halftime, maybe, but I don't know. Maybe you can tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you would still be able to get a pie, but not as you know it. I mean, only in the sense that I think from this standpoint, the way that you do get your food, your drink, even your merchandise that's all going to be limited to through your mobile now. Same as ticketing, paper tickets on the back of this are going to be pretty unlikely to carry on. Basically anything that is going to eliminate any opportunities for physical contact and can be avoided is going to be. So obviously queuing up at a concession stand and entering a ground using a paper ticket are two of those things that fall under that category. Kind of like those real-time stadium operation systems that we were talking about before. This is another thing that maybe was, would have been considered a luxury or a kind of nice to have before COVID, but now it's probably going to become almost universal where it's possible. So that kind of in-seat ordering technology that we've seen deployed at some venues, but kind of not widely adopted. I think it's definitely going to become part of that. And I mean, you think about it, that's going to help maintain social distancing in several ways. So it prevents fans from touching a payment terminal by allowing them to purchase food through credit card information on their phone. It eliminates the need for fans to queue in crowded lines, either through an allocated pickup time or a notification that their order's ready. And then even from an operator perspective, mobile ordering allows those venue managers to control how many people are coming up to a concession stand at any given time. So I think that's definitely something that venue operators are going to be adopting. It's just, I think it kind of comes as it's a bit of a no-brainer in terms of maintaining that social distancing element. And yeah, the sort of the person that I spoke to about this was a guy called Anthony Perez. He's the chief executive of a company called VenueNext, who kind of provide these sort of mobile ordering solutions. He was formerly the chief marketing officer at the Orlando Magic as well. But we had quite an interesting conversation. Actually, he was telling me why he's expecting the adoption of this technology to accelerate after COVID-19, and also, why he thinks it's not just going to be for that period immediately after. It's something that is going to stick.
With COVID-19 is everyone is starting to view those types of solutions as critical to their business going forward. But we've been out there with this message and vision for a long time. So I think a big part of it is because you haven't seen the venues really go all in, so to speak. It's always been, if you kind of think like historically about mobile ordering and express pickup and some of these things, it's always been an option, but it's kind of like on the side. It's not a focal point of the operation. And I think what has happened with COVID-19 is now these solutions are becoming the focal point of the operation, and everything that we have pushed towards, which is greater marketing that's going to drive that higher adoption. All those things are going to start to happen, and I think that venues are going to find, regardless of how fan behavior or potential aversions may change once there's a vaccine and some of these things, I think they'll find that their operation is better having deployed these types of solutions, and hopefully find ourselves entrenched in the way that these things are done going forward, regardless of the potential pandemic concerns over time.
Now, some of this stuff I can see. I mean, like, I'm a Brighton fan. I go to the Amex. I can see all of this technology being kind of seamlessly fitted in there. But you're telling me that I go to Selhurst Park, I sit in that dreary away end, and all of these options are suddenly going to be available to me. Are these things that are going to kind of be temporary, like installed whilst we have kind of reduced capacities and like stadia are better able to manage them, or do you think these kind of have to be permanent, or are going to stay long after we go back up to what we hope is 100% capacity?
Well, I definitely couldn't imagine a robot roaming the concourses of Selhurst Park now. But I think definitely some of these things that we've spoken about are going to become universal when stadiums are back to full capacity. I think the things we spoke about first are temporary, so the sort of socially distanced queues, the staggered entry times. I think eventually, once you do have a vaccine in circulation, those sort of temporary measures are going to sort of disappear, as they are in sort of hopefully our everyday walk of life as well. But I think those things that we've been talking about latterly, all of those technologies, which, for the time being are going to play a really crucial role in maintaining social distancing within venues. I think they'll also improve the operations within venues. So it's kind of like what we've spoken about. This doesn't just apply to venues. It's kind of what we've been speaking about in terms of the sports industry ever since the pandemic started. It's kind of brought some things forward. It's accelerated the digital transformations of some companies, and I think what this is going to do is it's probably going to make venues smarter. They're going to become more digitalized, and I think something that sort of started me when I spoke from my interview with Anthony Perez was that he said, once venues have adopted these technologies and they have kind of seen the benefits of it, they're not really going to see any reason to go back. So yeah, I'd say that sort of some of those things that we were talking about at the start maybe will be pretty temporary, and we won't sort of have to abide by them for the rest of our event going experience. But I do think that some of these things we've been talking about latterly, kind of, even some of the cleaning innovations, the real-time stadium operation systems, and basically using your mobile to do everything within a venue, I think those are definitely things that are going to stay way beyond this.
Well, I'll know who to come and complain to when I can't get a pie delivered to me in my seat at Selhurst Park in 2022. I mean, I think that pretty much sums it up for where we are with this feature. If you do want to read it, it's a really good read, actually. I'd fully recommend it. It's online now, under the sort of slightly more SEO friendly title of "What Will the Post-COVID Venue Experience Look Like?" But if you want to wait for the paper edition, the issue 110 of SportsPro Magazine will be arriving through letterboxes very, very soon. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we're now going to move on to part 2 of this week's SportsPro podcast. Sam, who seems to have an endless knowledge of the post-COVID in-venue experience, spoke to Botan Osman, who's the chief executive of a company called Restrata. They've been involved in creating the biosecure environment for the recent England-West Indies Test Series, and they're now helping to get fans back into stadia in the UK. Sam spoke to him about what those trials have entailed and how the Restrata platform is helping to maintain social distancing in venues, and will assist with the kind of the track and trace element of what we're going to see next, and also the role that technology is going to play in returning fans to stadia in the future.
Help us spread the word about the SportsPro Podcast. Subscribe, like and share our content on social. Join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag SportsProPod. And if you're enjoying our work, why not leave us a rating and a nice review on your podcast platform of choice? And if you want to get in touch, you can send us an email, podcast@sportspromedia.com. The SportsPro Podcast. We're listening too.
Botan, thanks very much for joining us on the SportsPro Podcast. Before we get into things, how are you keeping?
Very well, very well. Thank you for having me, and it's good to be here to discuss this vital topic.
Good stuff. So, I mean, you've obviously been pretty busy in recent weeks, playing a part in sport getting back underway here in the UK. Before we kind of get on to some of the events that you've been involved with, would you maybe be able to tell us a little bit about the Restrata platform, just in terms of what it was initially developed for and how it's been adapted in light of COVID-19?
Yeah, absolutely. So our kind of starting point always as a company since 2006 was about how do we use design and technology to help protect people and assets so that businesses can just focus on what they do best, which is make energy, build skyscrapers or make sports events happen. So, and with that mission, I guess over the years we helped design whether it's designing Barcelona FC's security and technology into their stadium, whether it's helping with technology design of skyscrapers around the world. We over the years decided that there was a gap in the market when it came to trying to manage a kind of in a holistic fashion people's safety, asset safety, etc. across an operation. And that's why we sort of invested heavily in building the Restrata platform quite a number of years ago, and really it was launched in earnest in 2018, and it was designed really for critical national infrastructure, and for energy companies, and some corporates. When you want to understand where are my people right now, how do I safeguard them? If there's an incident, how do I make sure I know where people are, so that I can do something about it? And on a day-to-day basis, how do I digitize my operations so that if I am deploying people onto a site, if I'm moving people between sites, if visitors are arriving at my building, all of that is digitized and automated so that that wealth of data is there so that you can respond much easier. So that's what was really sort of built around. And we believed, and still do, of course, that the last mile matters a lot, in terms of there are a lot of risk-based systems that depend on where people are traveling to, and that's pretty much where they stop. For us, we believed heavily that the last mile, where the detail happens, is what matters most when you're really trying to protect people. And of course, in the age of COVID, the last inch matters these days. So it was what we found it was to be quite a helpful baseline onto COVID. But of course, prior to COVID, we had energy companies, logistics companies, drilling companies, etc., utilize our platform to ensure their safe operations and really to do something that's gratifying, which is help protect people.
Sure, that's great. And so obviously there's been quite a few sports venues chatting to you guys already, looking to use the platform. I mean, I think that's sort of something that we were seeing prior to COVID. These sort of real time monitoring sort of platforms. That's something that sports venue operators were starting to use, but maybe wasn't quite being universally adopted. So I mean, how does the Restrata platform kind of differ from some of those other ones that are out there? I guess heat maps are something that people will probably think of when you're talking about this, but is kind of maybe the value in this being able to really, being able to tell the proximity and monitor the proximity of people rather than necessarily just where large groups are gathering?
Yeah, so there are of course within the world of stadia have been discussions for many years around the idea of a digitized stadium or a digital stadium, and the benefits are endless, and the technology that you mentioned around heat maps and the business intelligence that can provide to make decision making, all of that is extremely useful, and some venues have managed to find ways of sort of utilizing that type of technology. I guess where we differ is around thinking about the operation as a whole. Where are the fans? Where are the staff? Where are the players across that same period? Where are the stewards? How do you manage a particular incident if something was to happen? The incident could be as simple as, person to, Tom, please be deployed to, stand A or something, or it could be a major incident where you have to think about flow control. So I think the way that we approach it is, if you can use the system to help you in your day-to-day management of the venue, help you keep people safe, and help you understand the hyperlocation of the individual while they're in your stadium. Of course, privacy is extremely important, and I'm sure we'll come to that, but that's why it's about people being in your stadium, and it's about purpose-built sensors rather than using people's mobile phones. And with that, you're able to kind of understand the exact location of individuals so that you can better serve them across the way. So you're absolutely right. For a while now, there's been talk of a digital stadium, but I think there hasn't been the right momentum behind putting it in place for many venues. Potentially, this is an opportunity to use it to get over today's hump or today's challenge, but really come out of this with a stadium that's far more connected, and with the ability to build a fan experience across your entire grounds that is far more integrated with where they are and how they move around. We, of course, have been involved in stadia and in sports probably back to 2012, when we helped with the London Olympics in 2010 to 2012. And we then moved on, as I mentioned earlier, to work with Barcelona FC and some of the stadiums that were basically involved, that are going to be hosting the Qatar World Cup. However, until sort of COVID hit, although we were in discussions about the platform, I think this has become, for us, quite an obvious area where our platform can really help, not only with COVID, but to help manage a more efficient stadium, to maybe use stewards in a more efficient manner. Perhaps when there's an incident in a stadium, to be kept with our mind at rest, that we can actually help protect fans, to know where they are. So I think it's a really interesting trend that could be occurring, where it could help you get over today's challenge. But even better, post this, you're more ready for the next phase of the industry, really.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, obviously, I know that you guys were involved with the England versus West Indies Test series. Creating the biosecure environment that was required for that to take place. I mean, that was obviously played behind closed doors, but we are starting to see spectators return with venues operating at a reduced capacity. I mean, what have you sort of identified as some of the challenges with getting fans back into these sports venues? And when you're maybe talking to operators, what are some of the problems that they want you to help them solve?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned our work with the England and Wales Cricket Board. Very proud of that project. We turned it around very quickly. We believe that the ECB were pioneers really in this space. They were the first to digitize the way that they're going to do track and tracing, capacity management, etc. in the world of behind closed doors. And they've ran a very successful test series. Our technologies help them keep everybody secure within the biosecure bubble, understand where everybody is. If an incident is to occur, they know exactly who the person has been in contact with and what zones they've been in, and they're also able to manage the zones digitally. So that was a fantastic project, and it continues to be. I mean, it's now deployed in Aegis Bowl and Old Trafford, and they'll continue to use it across the many other test series that are to come. well into next year. So that's really sort of item one. But in terms of return of spectators, there's a number of sort of interesting challenges that are to come. I think challenge A is in bringing spectators into the stadium. How do you ensure that the steps you're taking to ensure that the fans are don't have symptoms, that the fans are okay, are basically auditable and integrated with the ticketing system that exists. I think item two is, once the fan is inside your stadium, how do you make sure that the social distancing that you are, you might have great signage, you might have sanitizer around, but how do you make sure that that is being adhered to in a way that is that is acceptable and auditable? And how do you encourage better behavior over time? And then three, how do you manage, the capacity of various stands if these seating areas are, have fans going into the concourse area to maybe for the F&B stands? How do you make sure that people are not moving too fast, and that you can pause movement when you need to if the concourse is too full? And then, of course, finally, track and trace. Being able to say that somebody reports a symptom, being able to say, well, you were in the stadium with maybe 20,000 people. However, by the way, this person only came into contact with maybe 50 people, and that's isolated, and that helps Public Health England and others, deal with the incident in a much more isolated fashion. And we think provides the confidence, and in our discussions with others, really provides the confidence to be able to slowly ramp up the number of fans that you would have in a stadium. So that's the kind of challenges that we have been talking to various stadia about. And we genuinely believe that all of that is achievable within the technology that we have. And we, of course, the trials that were going to happen this weekend, we had the technology installed in there within a week, really within about 10 days. The team wasn't happy about the short deadline, but they were smiling at the end of the project, and we were absolutely ready. But the technology is available these days, and we don't need to. We can take the guesswork out of it, and focus on the next phase, and ensure that today's phase of the limited return of fans is auditable, is track and traceable, and is digitally manageable, rather than essentially taking the guesswork out of it is what we believe the technology would do at this phase.
Sure. And I know you sort of touched on the trials that were due to go ahead this weekend. Obviously, that was for a cricket match between Surrey and Middlesex at the Oval in London. I mean, that's obviously had to that kind of got that trial anyway got sort of postponed at the last minute after the UK government announced that it was sort of delaying some of those pilot events amid a kind of a regional spike in cases here in the UK. But I mean, what was that trial set to involve? What was the experience going to look like for those fans who would have been attending that event?
So with that trial, we've been working with Surrey as well as DCMS, but Surrey County Cricket Club quite closely for the past period to ensure that our technology can help be part of the trial. Within that period, we had set up the Bluetooth sensors that we have across the stadium. The plan was to distribute for a section of the crowd, not the entirety, as almost like a sample, our sort of Bluetooth sensors. And across the trial, I mean, the trial was going to have 2,500 people, fans, spectators returning. That was almost the second phase. First phase had 1,000, and the fans would have been socially distanced in their seats. They would have had the right signage to understand behaviour, and I'm sure there was a number of aspects that DCMS and SGSCA and Surrey and others were sort of monitoring during the trial to ensure to understand how spectators would, how it would work when spectators do return, and of course all of the usual restrictions of masks and hand sanitizer, etc., would have existed. In the section that we had ready to run, and by the way, it was we believe it's a temporary delay. Of course, it was connected to the wider government decision on a number of lockdowns, etc. So there was a kind of a pause rather than a cancellation. And we look forward to that coming back in the near future. But in our section, each spectator would have received a Bluetooth badge, and with that we could have helped them manage sort of social. We could have seen social distancing essentially live. We would have been able to manage capacities in those particular areas, manage the issue, assure that people are not going into the wrong locations, and then of course track and trace those individuals across the stadium with others who were wearing the badges. So it would have been an absolutely live trial. We are 100% set up and ready to go at Surrey Cricket Club, and we really thank Surrey for their trust and their collaboration with us on this. I think it's very forward thinking of them, because they genuinely wanted to have technology as a dimension of these trials to really understand how it can truly help build something that is, as I said, takes the guesswork out of the return of fans.
This is the SportsPro Podcast.
I mean, obviously, you mentioned that trial was set to involve 200 fans taking part, total of 2,500 spectators attending the event. But I guess as we sort of look a bit further ahead, would the platform be able, to support bigger crowd returning once stadiums do get back to full capacity? Is that something you guys are already looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've modelled scenarios up to stadium numbers that are not around 120, 130,000, and we have no issues with the quantity of people, because this is an enterprise system that was designed to manage millions of people. It's not very phased by the by a single stadium, and managing those challenges within it. However, it is a dense crowd. I think whatever system is adopted today needs to be able to take the stadium or the club through the journey of partial return, semi-return, etc., up to full return, and then needs to be able to provide value thereafter. Otherwise, you're putting in something that's temporary that may not help you in the very much longer term, and that's what we're confident the Restrata system can do, and that's what we're in talks with various clubs and stadiums around the UK and elsewhere outside the UK also, because it's really all about assuring that it's fully integrated with what would be the entry and ticketing system and flows really well. B, once you're inside, it needs to be seamless for the fan. In fact, it needs to, if anything, better the fan's experience, across their time, and then thereafter, it needs to be able to secure the information well, so that when the fan, if anybody, fan or staff, reports symptoms, they can be rest assured that this stadium or this club knows exactly who they came into contact with, so that it can help other fans or themselves assure that the impact of of them going into a stadium, and this can be coupled with testing, it can be coupled with temperature checks at the gates. But at the end of the day, when you have the guesswork in a club or in a stadium, it's very difficult to know how contacts happened, and also if you don't have a digital footprint of what actually took place, it's hard to know how the performance of reopening is going. And therefore, if there's ever a discussion around, are we opening too fast or too slow, there's no hard evidence around the data that will help with that type of discussion. Definitely not on the side of the sports clubs.
Sure. And I'm interested because I know that you mentioned kind of improving the fan experience there. And I mean, a big part of this, I suspect, is, also not about not necessarily being too intrusive on fans as well, to the extent that it isn't changing their event experience too much. I guess, for example, fans enjoy attending sports, but a big concern, I imagine, will, not wanting to make them feel like some of the protocols that are in place kind of take away from that enjoyment, because I guess people don't really want to feel like they're being controlled too much. So, I mean, is that something that you're keeping in mind with the product, making it as seamless as possible and ensuring that it's not kind of impacting on that fan experience too much?
Yeah, so there's two things, I guess. Fans will be encouraged by the clubs to sort of adhere to guidelines, whether it's sanitizing or washing of hands, whether it's keeping their social distance, whether it's all the other areas that they'll be asked. In terms of the way the technology layers, it's really a layer that the fan can use and forget. So, if I have my season ticket or a lanyard that basically helps keep me safe and helps keep my fellow spectators safe, there's nothing additional that I should need to do to enable that technology. But basically, instead of getting a phone call to ask, well, who do you think you came into contact with during the match? That's all there, and that's all sort of accessible by the right authorities, of course, and by the club itself. So we have modeled this and we've looked at this in many ways, and it doesn't take away. In fact, it enhances, because it gives you that level of assurance that says, this club knows exactly what's happening, because we are in a pandemic. I mean, that's not to be forgotten. And the place that I'm going to knows exactly what's happening in that place, knows exactly who is going where and where the risks are, so that I can have a lower risk experience, and I can have peace of mind afterwards, that if something was to happen and I was to come into contact with somebody, I know that I would receive a phone call, and I'd much rather get that phone call than not, and remain worried maybe for weeks after attending the event. And I think it's about that. It's peace of mind for the club, it's peace of mind for the fan, more importantly, and of course it's peace of mind for the government to say that as we increase this reopening, we have real sort of visibility and control, over those bigger fans. And I think bigger fan numbers, and I think that should, and in every way we've modeled it, that is what can really enable us over the coming year and over the coming season to assure at some point, larger fan returns, or even full capacity fan returns, because this is not a beach where nobody knows everybody. This is an area where everybody's ticketed. We know who's coming in, and therefore we should be able to control it in a much better fashion than an open public area where you may not know where somebody's coming from.
Sure, of course. And I know you touched on this earlier, and it'd be remiss of me not to mention it. Whenever data is involved, there are a lot of conversations around privacy. So I mean, it does sound like there will be a lot of personal data involved in this about people. I mean, what are sort of some of those issues around privacy that you have to be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, that it's got to be designed, and we've designed it with privacy in mind, rather than the other way around, which is designed it and then thought about the privacy issue. And that's because our system is designed to hold people data across a much larger swathe of information than would be expected at a football club. So we would expect no more data than you would normally share when you go into a football match. No other personal data would be expected. Secondly, we don't rely on people's smartphones or their personal devices, and therefore that we have no interaction with that at all. In fact, the Bluetooth signal that comes from our antennas is proprietary, which means we don't see any other devices across the stadium at all. We can't even, we wouldn't heat map people's devices in the stadium either. So, we're not talking to people's personal devices at all. And then thirdly, the data is only held for a period of time until track and trace is useful. After that, it's deleted and destroyed quite easily. And fourthly, it's all held in a single secured location, rather than having personal data sitting in different locations. At the moment, we have this idea that when we walk into every shop, we give away our names, we give away our phone numbers, and potentially our addresses. And that personal information is currently sitting in, millions or thousands of, books around, or spreadsheets around the country. It's much better to have it in one single secure place that you can manage, and that you can wipe out when it's no longer necessary. So I think we've designed it with privacy in mind, so that you're rest assured that there is no data that's being used. And I think the final thing is people always worry about personal data being used to maybe advertise to them or monetize to them. That's that's 1,000,000% not the case. And of course, we, it's a system that's designed for safety and nothing else. So I think with those, when we have discussed this with clubs, etc., they can see that it's designed with privacy in mind.
For sure. And just before I let you go, Botan, just kind of keen to get your prediction on something. I guess obviously because there are going to be a lot of technologies being adopted in light of this at sports venues such as yours. But I mean, obviously for now they're kind of going to be seen as a necessity. But beyond this, beyond this sort of this period where fans are attending sport while COVID is still around and we don't have a vaccine. Beyond that, do you think that these technologies are going to be here to stay? Do you expect them to be adopted quite widely?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, look, this pandemic has created a set of. It has completely shaken up the adoption graph for so many different technologies. Whether that is, video conferencing, whether that is, remote working and remote systems, it's accelerated adoption in a way that is unbelievable. And at the moment, we need to do all of those things because there's a pandemic. But in 5 years' time, we may do it for some other reason. I think we should look at this in the same way. A stadium being digitized that can manage itself based on whatever preconditions there are in place to operate in a safe environment or in an efficient environment. That's the way that we should see it. And the fact that at the moment, what we need to do is to try and keep people 2 meters apart, try and have a means of track and tracing, and try and manage capacity. That's today's challenge, right? Our challenge in 3 years' time might be something wholly different, where we might have a safety risk or a security risk, or it might be something wholly different where we would like to have a very personalized experience for the fan when they come in. I think the fundamental of it is within an experience that is so containerized like a stadium, it's always a good thing to ensure that you always know where your fans are. It's a responsibility for the club to manage that in a way that is trackable, that is auditable, and helping you get over today's challenge. There is no question in my mind, at least, that technologies like the Restrata platform and others will become part and parcel of the stadium operations. And I think we've done the figures ourselves. The ability to bring even a percentage of the fans back into these stadiums pays back for these systems, and for our system at least, within a very, very, very short space of time. And I'd be more than happy to tell each club how short that is that is interested, but in a very short space of time, and then gives them multi-year ability to digitize and manage their club. So it's a very difficult challenge that we all have ahead of us. But in some ways, the silver lining is that it's pushing us all in every industry, especially in the sports industry, to think about our digital future that is complementary and hand in hand with the physical experience that we want, and every sports team and every sports club wants to provide every fan.
For sure. Brilliant, Boston. I think that's a nice positive note to end on. Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and all the best with the trials. Hope it all goes well. Thanks for speaking to us.
No, thank you very much, and love the opportunity to sort of talk about this, and we're here to have more of these discussions with clubs and others.
Join the conversation with the SportsPro community. Follow us on Twitter @SportsPro. Find us on Instagram @sportspro.media, and connect to SportsPro Media on LinkedIn, where you can also become a part of our specialist OTT community. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
And that's it for this week's edition of the SportsPro Podcast. Let me just say my thanks to Botan Osman, Sam Carp. Thank you, Sam.
Cheers, Tom. Thanks for having me and for teeing up some questions.
And the next edition of the SportsPro Podcast will be back very soon. Thanks very much for listening to this episode. Goodbye.
The SportsPro Podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.